And thanks to you at home for joining us this hour. Speaking of history, the two independent special prosecutors who pursued the Watergate scandal during the Nixon administration were Archibald Cox in the first instance and Leon Jaworski. Jaworski ended up getting appointed after President Nixon initiated the so-called Saturday Night Massacre when he forced the firing of first Watergate special prosecutor Archibald Cox. He had to fire his way through the upper echelons of the Justice Department until he'd find someone who would go ahead and fire Archibald Cox for him. I mean, ultimately, we know how all of that ended, right? Leon Jaworski got Archibald Cox's old job. He, much to Nixon's dismay, carried on with the investigation that Archibald Cox had started. The evidence that had been produced over the course of that investigation was ultimately handed over to Congress in a document that has become known as the Watergate Roadmap. Congress used that evidence that was collected by the Watergate special prosecutors to themselves draw up really damning articles of impeachment against Richard Nixon. And then it all came to an end, right? Nixon, knowing that he was not going to survive an impeachment vote, ended up resigning the presidency. But whatever happened to old Archibald Cox? The first Watergate special prosecutor, the guy who was fired at the end of the Saturday Night Massacre. Well, turns out after Nixon fired him, he landed at a good government organization called Common Cause. And at Common Cause, just 10 years after Nixon resigned in the year 1984, Common Cause, under the leadership of Watergate special prosecutor Archibald Cox, they did something they had never done before. They issued a public report and sent a letter to every single United States senator urging, for the first time ever, that a nominee for a cabinet position be rejected by the Senate. Common Cause had never done something like this before, but they decided that this particular nominee was so bad, so dangerous, had such a terrible record, particularly when it came to ethical issues and corruption issues, that they just decided they had to take a stand. Archibald Cox warned the Senate that this nominee had a, quote, lack of ethical sensitivity, that he had shown a blindness to abuse of position. So that good government group, Common Cause, they did kind of go out on a limb, telling senators, say no to this guy. We've never said this before about a cabinet official, but this one, do not let this one be confirmed. That nominee they were so opposed to was named Ed Meese. Ronald Reagan had nominated Ed Meese to become Attorney General. Now, Ed Meese had, in fact, by this point, sort of already had his share of scandal, even before Reagan nominated him to be Attorney General. Meese had been involved in the Reagan campaign when Reagan won the presidency in 1980, and the transition was underway with the Carter administration getting ready to leave and the Reagan folks getting ready to come in and take over. To run the operations of the Reagan transition, the incoming folks had set up a financial entity called the Transition Trust. And during the transition, before the start of the Reagan administration, that Transition Trust wrote Ed Meese a $10,000 check, which he then promptly deposited in his own personal bank account. And what the Transition Trust said that $10,000 was for was something they recorded as moving expenses. Now, it's, of course, kosher for there to be a reasonably well-funded effort to set up an on-ramp for the new administration, to give them office space so they can, get all their ducks in a row and they can start doing briefings with the outgoing administration, right? But $10,000 checks for moving expenses for one individual person from the campaign? That's not right. And after Ed Meese was informed that him taking a $10,000 check from the transition for moving expenses is something that would likely be considered a crime, he took swift action. And you might think in such a circumstance, particularly at the outset of a new administration that really wasn't looking for scandal right out of the gate, you might think that what you would do in such a circumstance, if only to avoid being a distraction at the start of your candidate's new presidency, you might think what you would do is return the $10,000, right? Oh, no. In Ed Meese's case, he just had them erase the designation that the check was for moving expenses, and he instead had them recategorize it. So now the $10,000 check to Ed Meese would be listed as consulting fees. And then he just kept the money. Oh, it can't be moving expenses? That's a crime? Well, we'll just erase that and call it something else. Ka-ching! That was Ed Meese during the transition before Ronald Reagan was even sworn in. Ed Meese then became a staffer in the Reagan White House during Reagan's first term. As a White House official, he got himself involved in further scandal. He came under investigation by a court-appointed special counsel who looked at him for multiple allegations of corruption. Specifically, Ed Meese was alleged to have given a whole bunch of different people jobs in the administration after those people had provided him various forms of financial assistance. So when Ronald Reagan said, after all of that scandal, that he would put Ed Meese in charge of the Justice Department and make him the top law enforcement official in the country, this good government group, Common Cause, run by Archibald Cox of Watergate investigation fame, right, they took a hard look at Ed Meese's record, including the independent special counsel's report on those allegations of corruption against Meese as a White House official. Meese was not criminally charged after that independent counsel did that investigation into him. And because he wasn't indicted, he claimed he had been totally vindicated by that investigation. Turns out, if you actually looked at the report of that investigation, Meese had not been totally vindicated. The report was very critical of his judgment and his ethical standards. Archibald Cox took a hard look at that report. Common Cause produced a digest of that report that was easier to understand for the public. They took a look at Meese's history and decided that for the first time in the history of Common Cause, they would prevail upon senators to please not vote for this guy, please not confirm this guy as Attorney General. He nevertheless was confirmed as Attorney General, and thus started one of the more disastrous terms in U.S. history for a sitting Attorney General. I mean, probably the thing for which Ed Meese is best remembered, both by his supporters and his detractors, is that Ronald Reagan put him in charge of a presidential commission on porn. Ed Meese was assigned to head up the anti-pornography crusade of the Reagan administration, which resulted in, among other things, a 2,000-page report, which was very poorly received because it did not appear to be at all based on any empirical evidence. Nevertheless, Attorney General Meese formed what he called an obscenity strike force inside federal law enforcement. He then led the Justice Department to prioritize new and creative means of bringing prosecutions to try to blot out and eliminate the scourge of pornography from America. And while that must have been exhausting, Ed Meese also became sort of the animating legal force in the Reagan administration behind the Iran-Contra scandal. Someday somebody will make an amazing blockbuster movie about how astonishing the Iran-Contra scandal was. I think because I'm in LA, I keep thinking about that. Some Hollywood person out there, you should option Jane Mayer's old book about the Iran-Contra scandal. It should be, anyway. But for all of the craziness of that scandal and the indictments and the crazy cowboy adventuring of that scandal and the miracle that Ronald Reagan did not get impeached for that scandal, the bullseye at the center of Iran-Contra is that it was just so blatantly and knowingly illegal. Right before the Iran-Contra scandal happened, right before the Reagan administration did what they did, Congress kind of knew what Reagan wanted to do, and they passed a law to stop him. Congress passed a law. There was an American law in effect and on the books, which said the Reagan administration can't give aid to the Contras in Nicaragua. And then the Reagan administration definitely gave aid to the Contras in Nicaragua, secretly, even though there was an explicit law prohibiting them from doing so. They sold missiles illegally to Iran to do it, to get the money that they were, I mean, this whole crazy thing. But the reason the Reagan administration ended up getting in so much trouble for Iran-Contra is because they just blatantly broke that law, which specifically said they couldn't do what they did. And the reason they broke that law, ultimately, is because of Ed Meese. Because Ed Meese, Ronald Reagan's Attorney General, very soberly concluded that when it comes to following the law, presidents don't really need to do that. Yes, there was an explicit law just passed by Congress that very clearly and unequivocally intended to stop the Reagan administration from doing this thing that everybody knew they wanted to do. When the Reagan administration went ahead and did it anyway, Ed Meese was like, I know there's a law, but if the president does it, it's not really illegal. Right? The laws don't actually apply to presidential behavior. You want to break the law, Mr. President? I got your back. That was his legal advice. That was the legal spine on which they built the whole Iran-Contra scheme, for which, again, I contend it is a miracle Reagan never got impeached. During that Iran-Contra scandal and the subsequent big investigation into it, a whole bunch of documents that Ed Meese was supposed to be securing and preserving for that investigation mysteriously ended up getting shredded by White House officials. The stuff that Meese was supposed to be making sure was retained, miraculously, all that stuff ended up in the shredder. I mean, this is when he was serving as Attorney General of the United States. Ed Meese, also as Attorney General, came under scrutiny yet again from yet another independent counsel for a whole new raft of new corruption charges while he was serving as AG. That independent counsel was reported contemporaneously at the time to be investigating, quote, whether Meese violated the law in helping a New York defense firm obtain an Army contract, whether Meese violated the law in contacting officials on behalf of a friend who put together a $1 billion Mideast oil pipeline project, and whether Meese violated the law in participating in telephone regulation matters at a time he was trying to sell his own stock in phone companies. So he's under investigation for all of that alleged criminal behavior while he's serving as Attorney General. The first one that I mentioned there, the Army contract thing, that one ended up being a doozy. Meese's friend, who he helped hook up with that Army contract, and his own financial advisor, who he shared with that friend, and a bunch of other people, all ended up getting indicted and convicted and going to jail in that scandal. It was called the WedTech scandal. Meese ultimately had to testify in some of those cases and was forced to admit from the stand that he had been way more involved in that scandal than he had publicly admitted to. But this, again, was while he was serving as Attorney General of the United States, all this stuff was happening. He's under investigation for all those criminal allegations. And because of that, under Ed Meese at the Justice Department, there was a sort of famous revolt at the Justice Department sort of executive level right underneath him. I mean, he's the Attorney General, the number one official in the Justice Department. The number two official in the Justice Department is the Deputy Attorney General, the job that Rod Rosenstein famously had early in the Trump administration. Well, under Ed Meese, his Deputy Attorney General resigned in protest of having to work under somebody like Ed Meese. Also, the head of the criminal division at the Justice Department resigned in protest at having to work under somebody like Ed Meese, right, who was under all of these multiple criminal investigations while still running the Justice Department himself. 4 other top officials resigned at the same time, along with those top Justice Department officials. All of those officials had actually conveyed a demand to the White House. They told White House Chief of Staff James Baker that Reagan needed to remove Ed Meese for the good of the country. Needed to get him out as Attorney General, get him out for the good of the country, the good of the Justice Department. If Reagan wouldn't do that, they said they would all resign in protest. Well, they all ended up resigning in protest because Reagan wouldn't remove Ed Meese. He still liked Ed Meese. He was his longtime friend. He wouldn't let him go. Ultimately, the only way they were able to pry Ed Meese out of the Justice Department was when that last independent counsel who was investigating him released his own sort of mammoth report on the corruption allegations against Meese. The day the independent counsel submitted his report on WedTech and the working on phone stuff when he was trying to sell his phone stocks and all those other allegations, it was only the day that independent counsel submitted his report on those corruption allegations against Ed Meese, that day was the day Meese finally resigned.
Life, where I intend to continue making...
Attorney General Edwin Meese today with a surprising announcement about his future.
I have informed the President that I will be leaving the administration towards the end of July or early in August in order to accept new opportunities in the private sector.
NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw.
Good evening. Attorney General Edwin Meese's announcement that he will resign by the end of July or early August came shortly after the special prosecutor today filed a lengthy report. As NBC's James Polk reports tonight, even if Meese escapes prosecution, he leaves behind a record that has been criticized by Republican and Democrat alike.
When the special prosecutor's report was carried into the courthouse after a year-long investigation, Meese was on a drug-busting trip to California. Meese did not wait to read the report before telephoning the president to resign.
Ed Meese never ended up going to prison the way that Nixon's Attorney General John Mitchell did. But among all the attorneys general we have ever had in this country, he's really right up there in terms of having one of the most scandal-ridden, ethically challenged tenures at the top of the Justice Department, up to and including the fact that he was the subject of multiple criminal investigations himself. And that last independent counsel ended up referring Meese's conduct to his own Justice Department for review and potential censure. And I mean, I know in some ways we kind of got it bad right now. I think it's helpful to look back on other times in U.S. history and remember that we have had it bad in some of the same ways at other times in our history, too, and we figured out a way to make it through. So, like, the Ed Meese story is good to remember. The John Mitchell story is good to remember when you look at this Justice Department under William Barr and you think about, you know, how bad it could get and how abused the Justice Department could be. Like, the Justice Department has been in pretty bad hands before, and there's been consequences for it, and it's worth keeping that in mind. And, you know, in the Ed Meese case, it turns out to be particularly instructive for us today in 2019, in part because of where all of these folks who were involved in his scandal-ridden tenure in Washington, where they all ended up. I mentioned that during Meese's disastrous tenure as Attorney General, other senior officials resigned when the White House wouldn't remove Meese from his position. One of the very high-profile Justice Department guys who resigned, the guy who was the head of the criminal division at the Justice Department, who stepped down in protest against Meese's alleged corruption, his name was William Weld. Bill Weld. Where did he end up? Well, today in 2019, he's running for president as a Republican primary challenger to President Trump. Where did Ed Meese himself end up? Well, Ed Meese is still around and kicking. Ed Meese himself today turned up at the White House because President Trump today awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest award he can give. And if time is a circle, it's a circle in the form of a snake both biting on and choking on its own tail. Because there is Ed Meese, literally the anti-pornography crusader, the guy who launched the obscenity strike force at the Justice Department and dedicated himself to eliminating the scourge of pornography from America. There's him today receiving his medal from the man you can see here in one of his several roles in Playboy features. This was the Playboy Films Centerfold feature, sort of a softcore number from the year 2000. He also appeared in Playboy movies in the year 2001, and even way back in 1994, which was sort of still within very reasonable memory of Attorney General Ed Meese launching his presidential commission on pornography and his obscenity strike force with which he intended to wipe out all pornography in America. Attorney General Ed Meese today appeared delighted to be receiving his medal today from the president, who has been identified as Individual 1 in a case that put his own lawyer in prison for breaking federal campaign finance laws in order to pay hush money to a very well-known porn star before the 2016 election at the direction of President Trump. Mr. Obscenity Strike Force Meese, as I said today, just appeared to be happy to be getting his medal. And at this event today with President Trump, he did go out of his way to give a shout out specifically to President Trump's current attorney general, who will likely be on the same page of the history books about a certain type of attorney general in the annals of the U.S. Justice Department.
You have risen to continue the string of great attorneys general in this country, and I certainly appreciate what you're doing now. I must say, from my own experience, I understand what you're going through now.
Hats off to you, Bill Barr. I know where you're at. I've been there. You know, I didn't get indicted in the end. Take heart. And now look, you guys are giving me a medal.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.